Alright everyone, Marco Palmero, founder of Ulysses in Dubai. This video is directed to all the executives, business owners, entrepreneurs looking at the Middle East, or more specifically the UAE, for their growth plan, their expansion plan. So you might be considering, starting a business here, buying an existing one, or building up a new branch of your existing company. All these things are very interesting to me, and I think the region has a lot of potential for all these types of ideas. But I think there's a lack of content online sharing real experiences and real feedback of what's happening here, what's the reality of doing business here, and what are some of the challenges that you're going to have to face. So data you can find any place. Any advisory firm is going to be able to provide you with that. But what almost nobody is going to be able to do for you is share their experience, what happened in certain situation, and also what are the market dynamics when doing business in this region. And so I'm going to do that, and I'm going to be sharing not only my own experience, but the experience of my partners at Ulysses, who spend most of their career in this region. We have an aggregate experience of almost 150 years here. So I'm gonna kind of draw down some of their experiences and share them with you so that you can potentially make better decisions when it comes to executing your growth strategy here in the Middle East. So in order for us to have a little bit of context around this region, I'm gonna analyze briefly 3 key economies: United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Oman. And I'm going to just give you some technical info that can potentially set the tone for what's coming next. Now, again, data you can find any place, and many times people put too much weight on that. I think personally that data in the UAE and Middle East is still a big challenge, because despite data being accessible online or through advisory firms, not necessarily that data is as accurate as you might think it is. Most of the times people rely on these data to make decision, but the problem is not as good as you think it is. And again, I'm gonna give it to you because a lot of people want to know it. But my point here is, don't rely on that strictly to make important decisions, because it might be devious. So some of the metrics are right, others are not as accurate. So let me start with the United Arab Emirates, the place where I live. This is a relatively small country, and a relatively new country for that matter. We're talking about 12, 13 million people. They're broken down as follows: 70% are males, 3% are females. Now, the interesting thing about the UAE is that there's a high level of concentration in young population. 70% of people are between 25 and 55 years of age. Only 5% are above, 55, and the remaining is below 25. So there's a very young population in the UAE. And why is that the case? Well, as we will see later, there is a high concentration of expatriates in this country. And the reason for that is quite simple. The UAE were formed only 50 years ago as a confederation of emirates. And what happened at the time was these little tribes came together to become a nation, and they formed sort of like a confederation, very similarly to the US, but a couple of different things. The thing that happened next is that they wanted to develop the economy, but they didn't have enough workforce. So they needed to import people from other places, not only labor, but also experience, knowledge, and in all senses, people, right? So what happened is they started to create campaigns to bring people to the UAE, and what happened was 90% of people became expatriates in this particular country, and only 10% are local Emiratis, which kind of tells you that when you are in the UAE, you're in all senses in the Middle East, but you're not going to be dealing with local people all the time. In most situations, you're going to be dealing with expatriates, first generation expatriates for that matter. And so that kind of sets the tone of what the UAE environment is all about. There are going to be different perceptions, different ways of doing business that are going to be very much influenced by where this person is coming from. And that gives me the opportunity to talk about the breakdown of these expatriate population. Almost 40% of people here are from India, 15% are from Pakistan, so those are the two biggest communities. And then we got, below that, Egyptians and Filipinos that are both around 5%. The remaining 21% are other nationalities, Europeans like myself, Asia, Africa, you name it. Now, this is a very interesting thing because it kind of gives you a perception of how the UAE operate as a nation. They're a mixture of a lot of cultures, and many times people approach the UAE with a cookie cutter approach, which really doesn't work, as I'm going to tell you later, because the most important thing you can do here is learning how to navigate situations depending on the social and economic background of the person you're sitting in front of. But before we actually talk about all this, let's stick to the technical details for some time. Abu Dhabi and Dubai are the two, main hubs for population, and that's not a surprise, at least not for me. Immediately after it comes Sharjah, so these are the three main emirates, and then the other four are coming right after it. So there's a lot of talks about Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and rightfully so, because they're the places where a lot of people are concentrated. Now, most of the population in the UAE lives in urban areas, close to 90%, while only 10% lives in rural areas. And as we will see, that is the case for Saudi and Oman as well. Now, these two other economies don't have the high level of expatriates as the UAE has, simply because they were a bit more closed, and they started opening up only later in the years. UAE really made the mixture of culture one of their key foundations, and that's why we have such a great diversity in this particular country, which is something that, from my perspective, is very important to consider when people think about starting businesses, buying businesses, or even setting up a branch of their existing one, because a cookie cutter approach won't really work here. Many times I've seen companies that are specifically created to address the needs of a specific community. And that has been a very interesting experience for me, because it told me a lot about how the UAE works and operates. Now, in terms of numeric figures, if we want to say so, the GDP per capita is around 55 grand in terms of US dollars, while the gross domestic product for the country is around $500 billion. This for year 2024, at least that's a forecast, because 2024 is not over yet. So we're talking about a relatively small economy, but yet an economy where there's a huge disparity between rich, middle class, and labor. Again, you will see very different situations as you come to the UAE. There's a lot of workforce that is kind of like living below the means of regular people in Europe, America, or other places of the world. And then there's the upper bracket that is the super wealthy, living, life that people only can dream of, really. So it's a very skewed and artificial place, and many times people don't get that, and they approach it in the same way they would approach a normal country. And I think that is the wrong approach, and I will talk about the reasons later. Not only this is a young country, only 50 years old, but it's a country that went from sand to skyscrapers in only 50 years. So sometimes people get blinded by this glossy picture, especially when they come to Dubai, and they don't realize that sometimes the mentalities are still catching up with all this. And what you're seeing is not necessarily what you're going to find once you start dealing with people, right? Because the mentality it hasn't changed yet in some respect. in other respects, it's quite advanced. But I think we're going to be talking about that more in detail, later in this video. Before we actually do that, let me do the same analysis with Saudi and Oman. Now, when we talk about Saudi Arabia, of course, we're talking about higher population. We're talking about 37 million people, give or take. And interestingly, the split is 60% males, 40% females. My perception is that the reason why this is the case, more evenly balanced, is because there's a low concentration of expatriates, since the country was much more close to, outside influences. Now, in terms of demographic splits, people between 25 and 55 are around 50%. So 1 out of 2 people is between 25 and 55. Elderly are around 10% of the population, so over 55, we're talking about 10%. The remaining 35% of the people, or give or take 40%, is below 25. So a fairly young population, and a little bit higher concentration in terms of elderly people. As I mentioned before, the concentration is again heavy in urban areas. 85% of people are living there, while 50% are in rural areas. The main centers are, of course, Riyadh and Jeddah, with Mecca coming right after it. But the point is, there's a huge concentration in the city centers, and rightfully so. Now, I think we can talk about the expatriate phenomenon in Saudi and Oman, although it's not as relevant as the UAE. So I'm not going to dive too deeper into that. The point is, these two countries are still opening up. There are expatriates, but the vast majority of people are still locals. And again, they didn't have the necessity to import all these expatriates back in the day. And so they're just starting this process of welcoming expatriates and growing their expatriate community. Now, in terms of GDP per capita, Saudi Arabia is much lower than UAE. We're talking about $30,000 per year as forecasted for 2024. Instead, from a gross domestic product, GDP for Saudi Arabia, we're talking about $1.1 trillion forecasted for 2024. Now, again, this data is something you can consider, but I won't want you to take it as a pure fact, because sometimes this information might not necessarily be 100% accurate. So what I'm sharing with you is what a lot of people know, what is known in the public, but it is important to dive deeper into the analysis and be on the ground to understand if these numbers are actually, pristine. And I'm going to share, some of my experiences with that later in the video. Now, before we do that, let's talk about Oman briefly. So Oman, in terms of population, we're talking 4.5 million people in total, and the gender split is 60% males, 40% females. Now, the concentration in terms of demographics is 50% of people are between 25 and 55 years of age. Above that, 67%, and the remaining is below 25 years of age. Now, the concentration is again mostly in urban areas. 88% is in urban areas. Only 12% is in rural areas. And again, most of the people are in the most known city centers, one of which being Muscat, the capital. So in terms of how the population is concentrated, we're talking about similar situation to UAE and Saudi Arabia. Now, in terms of GDP per capita, Oman is set at across, around $23,000 per capita. In terms of GDP for the country, we're talking about, $110 billion forecasted for 2024. So in terms of economy size, Saudi is on top, UAE comes second, and Oman comes third. Now, these are just some key considerations to give you a little bit of understanding about how the main economies of the Middle East work. Now, I think what we're going to talk about now is the unspoken things, the most I would say secret things that people find out once they start doing business in this region, and some of the experiences that I had doing business here. I think one of the most important thing we can start with is, why is it that I positively believe that the UAE is the best place for people to start if they want to enter the region? It doesn't matter if they want to start a business, they want to build a branch of their existing operations, or they want to buy something. The reason why I believe that goes back to the reason I mentioned in the very beginning. The UAE are a very dynamic place, a place where a lot of different cultures aggregate, and the rules and regulations of this country have been created so that it is actually easier for expatriates to set up their businesses or their personal lives in the country. That creates a situation in an environment where people can tap into the country quickly in much, I would say, in an easier way compared to Oman and Saudi. The beauty is also that you can then use the UAE as a hub to expand your business across the Middle East. The reason why I'm saying this and why I'm sharing this is an opinion is because I've seen so many companies getting burned simply because they wanted to follow the shiny object that a lot of people were putting in front of their eyes. Now, in most recent times, everybody's hot and bothered about Saudi Arabia, right? Everybody thinks that it is the place to be. And if you come to the region, or maybe even outside the region, you will find tons of people that are going to try to sell you on the idea of setting yourself up in Saudi Arabia, setting up a business, partnership, what have you. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. The opportunity is indeed huge because the economy is growing. The country lacks infrastructure. And for people that have experience, know-how, and knowledge, it becomes a slam dunk to be there. It's almost like tapping into a market that is not being crowded by the big players yet. The challenge is that it's not as straightforward as you might think it is to do things in Saudi Arabia. It is complex. The country was closed for a lot of times, and people were kind of like rejecting foreign influences a lot. A lot of times people don't believe that, and they kind of like buy into this feeling of going to Saudi because it's the place where you're going to make a lot of money. Well, if it sounds too easy, it generally it isn't the case. And I think, that's kind of obvious and it's common sense. But I've seen so many big companies getting screwed over because they just wanted to be in Saudi right away and just wasting a lot of money, time, and mental energy trying to set themselves up there right away instead of just taking an approach that was a bit smoother and maybe enter the UAE first, and then once they've built a reputation there, progressively enter a country like Saudi. So I'm not saying that the UAE are the best place to start because I live here and because it's the place where I conduct my own business. I'm just saying that I've seen so many other companies getting into trouble by trying to do the opposite, that to me, UAE becomes the most natural answer for a lot of companies, independently of what you want to do, independently if you want to buy a business, if you want to start a business, or if you want to build a branch of your existing company, or even partner with somebody. It doesn't really matter. The place to start, from my opinion, is the UAE, and also based on my partner's experience. They've been here 40 years, and they still say that Saudi, Oman have a lot of catch up to do. They're doing it, and they're going to be significantly bigger as economies than the UAE if they do a good job. But as of now, the place where people can really establish themselves and thrive is the UAE. And then from that point on, they can look at other markets favorably. The problem is a lot of people don't listen to this, and they need to, waste their money and their time pursuing ideas and advisors who just don't have their best interest at heart. Now, this might sound like a harsh truth, but I believe in facts. And again, in this video, I want to share my personal experience doing business here, right? And I think that is what's going to help a lot of people watching this potentially make a good decision whether or not this place is the right fit for them. Of course, UAE have their challenges too. I mean, I'm not going to hide. One of the biggest problems of this country is that, as I mentioned before, it's kind of artificial, and many people believe when they come here that they're going to be dealing with a very advanced society, almost like Western civilization. Now, despite the fact that the infrastructure has been set up to look like a, futuristic place and a very open place to do business and live, there's still quite a few challenges that need to be addressed. And that is not something that you can see or touch unless you are into it. Some of the struggles I faced in recent years is dealing with different cultures and different mentalities. Because when you are in a place where 90% of people are expatriates, invariably you're going to be dealing with expatriates a lot of times. And people who are first generation expatriates are going to bring to the negotiation table or into the business world their own frameworks and their own mentalities. And those things are going to change dramatically depending on where this person is coming from. And I'm not only talking about, moral, ethical codes. I'm talking about the ways you conduct business. And so there might be a lot of friction in dealing with people if you don't understand how to navigate these problems. And it's funny because I've seen, the ones having the biggest problem doing business here and addressing these concerns are the Americans, which is kind of funny, right? I lived in America for 3 years, and I love America. It's one of the best places I've ever been to. But one of the problems and the challenges they have is that they always believe that everything they do is right and there's no alternative, and it's either their way or the highway. And that kind of approach ain't gonna be successful here in the region. It doesn't matter how experienced you are, how big of a company you are. It doesn't matter really how well you do your job. If you don't understand how to navigate different mentalities here, you're not gonna be successful. And again, I could give you tons of examples of big companies who tried to set themselves into the UAE and failed miserably, independently of the budget they had, the experience they had in other markets, and the qualified people on the ground. The problem of the region is that you need to understand how to navigate, how to deal with people, how to interact with them, how to address their key concerns in a very effective manner, because what it is a concern from an Italian like myself might not be a concern from an Indian person, and vice versa. And so many times people approach the region in a very cookie cutter way, especially if they're corporates, and they end up failing miserably. And so I think, some of the examples I can give you, there's really countless, but are companies that decided that they wanted to set up their business here, and they set up a branch or an office, but they put into place people that were not some of their key executives. And so they said, okay, we can keep our headquarters in London or New York or whatever, Paris, but we're going to set up an office there and we want to get business there. So we're going to send some executives, some, directors or whatever there, and they're going to be the ones in charge of that location. The problem is that most of the cultures here want to deal with decision makers, and they want to deal with decision maker in person. Zoom won't cut it. Calls won't cut it. And a lot of other people don't realize that, and they end up closing these offices 1-2 years down the line because they're unable to crack the code of the Middle East. It was actually a lot simpler than it sounded, but most of them fail to understand that people look at business with different eyes here. There's a lot of emphasis on personal relationships and I would say interaction that you need to do before you actually get to the point, if we want to say so. One of the biggest challenges I faced when I first came here, and remember, I was coming from America, so I had that kind of mindset, was that I was dealing with people in a very straightforward manner, and I felt that would be appreciated because I was talking what I felt was in my mind, and I was always saying the truth. But what I realized is that a lot of people were receiving these messages badly, and that was jeopardizing a lot of business relationships. And so I had to switch the approach and become more open and indirect in the way I was interacting with people, and also in that process accept the fact that there was a trust building exercise that I needed to go through, independently of how big of a company I was. There was still this process that people needed to go through of sitting down with the other side and getting to know him or her. And until that thing was clear in my head, I wasn't able to crack the code. And again, many times companies have failed in doing that because they just approach business in a very straightforward manner and they stick to business most of the times. That doesn't really work here. And if you're sticking to that, it's going to take you a long time to accomplish the desired outcome. And in most cases, you're not even going to accomplish that. Building up interpersonal relationships and dealing with people in a very human way is key to cracking the UAE, and not only the UAE, the Middle East in general. I think my perception has changed over time, and what I came to realize is that people need to factor in more time to build those relationships and getting the results they need, but they also need to understand that the longest way is the shorter one, because if you want to only push, you're not going to get nowhere. These roads never lead to success. And all that applies to pretty much all things you want to do in UAE. You want to start a business, you want to acquire a business, you want to set up a branch, we want to build partnerships. Same principle applies. One of the things that we found out as we worked with a lot of people that wanted to acquire companies was that it was important for us to focus on the relationship with the seller a lot more than in other geographies. And again, one of the things that we do best is exactly acquisition. So if one of these things that you're contemplating is buying companies here in the region and expanding through acquisitions, then it will be worthwhile to have a chat and see how we can support you in navigating those challenges in the Middle East. But I think from that perspective, Oman and Saudi are pretty much the same. To some respect, they're even worse because the mentality is much closer. I mean, it's not as open to foreigners, and that is one of the reasons why, as I said, it's much more complicated to do business there right away. The reason why UAE are a good entry point is because they enable you to build relationships and credibility that's then going to spread out across the region. And sometimes companies, or entrepreneurs for that matter, say to me, well, I got my existing track record back home, I'm going to leverage that to come to the region. Fine. Not a lot of people are going to give a shit about that, to be totally transparent. Unless you are, I don't know, a big conglomerate. I mean, if you are Amazon, you're not going to give a shit about that, okay? You're just Amazon. But if you are, let's say, a 7, 8, 9-figure business, those things are going to be very, very relevant to you. And one other thing that people need to get accustomed to is the time frame. Independently of how you approach things in UAE, Saudi, Oman, other countries of the Middle East, business is going to take longer than you think. And you just got to be okay with it. I was so impatient when I first came here because, again, I was coming from an American mentality. I want this done yesterday. And little did I know that driving things in that way was very counterproductive, and it was driving people away, literally. And again, I came to the realization that the longer way is the shorter ones, because it's just a matter of how the country and the region flows. Things do take more time, mostly because of trust issues and because of the fact that many times people come here, stay for some time, and then they relocate somewhere else. So people really want to understand what you're all about before they actually decide that they want to do business with you. And it applies for all companies of all sizes, companies that want to do pretty much any kind of project. And it is a concept that I needed to get if I really wanted to establish myself here, right? Now, in terms of establishing yourself or a company in this particular region, I not only find that UAE are the best place to start, I also find they're the place where you're going to have the least amount of challenges, independently of whether you buy a business, you start one, or you develop a partnership. Also, there are a place where the legal framework is a little bit more clear, and there are ways for you to set up businesses that are under British law, which I think it's an important aspect that many companies may want to consider, especially if they're operating internationally. And I'm not a lawyer, but I think that is something that is going to be very relevant to a lot of people. Many might not want to be bounded by local regulations. They might want to have a more flexible way to look at things, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of people start from the UAE. Now, one of the things that I didn't mention early on, but it's kind of obvious, is that a lot of people come to UAE because there's no tax. I mean, there used to be no tax. Now there's 9% corporate. But the point is, there are a lot of advantages in starting from the UAE. Saudi is also quite advantageous. Oman is quite advantageous too. The point is, UAE used to incentivize a lot of entrepreneurs, business owners to come here because they could literally, have no tax and operate quite freely. Now that is changing slowly, but it is changing. So you got to be aware of that, even if you're just wanting to be in the UAE as a holding or not operating in the market actively. It is something that will become relevant, and of course you will have to talk with legal experts for that matter, but I think it's important to bring into your attention. What I think it's interesting from my perspective in doing business here is that probably one of the challenges of the UAE is that the market is much more saturated than Saudi and Oman are, which is one of the reasons why a lot of people are jumping in these other geographies, right? They think it's much easier to do business there because there's less competition. And that is true. But again, as I mentioned, a lot of other challenges that are hiding below the surface or below the sand, as I would say. The UAE is certainly more competitive and is certainly more saturated. So if you're planning to start a business from scratch here, I think you really need to know what you're doing, and you also need to be fully aware that it's going to cost you more and take you longer than you think. If you're doing it in the other geographies, yes, you might be as successful or even more successful. But again, you're going to face less competition, but more challenges and roadblocks coming from regulations, things that are unclear, and challenges that are in the environment, in the business environment, in the business mentality. So be aware of that, at least from my perspective, when you pick where you want to start and how you want to start. One of the reasons why I stress the concept of acquisitions in the UAE is because a lot of people are hot and bothered about starting a business here. Then they realize after 2 years that the market is saturated. They don't know how to differentiate themselves from the competition, and they're losing money. And so they try to sell their assets, but nobody wants them, and so they go bankrupt. Story that happened, thousands of times. The reason why I stress acquisition is exactly that, because you can focus on what is already working here, and despite the market being saturated, you can still find profitable assets. You acquire them, you get their market share, and then you're done. You don't need to worry about the challenges of starting a business or setting up a location of your existing one, for that matter. The challenges are the same because you need to conquer market share that is somebody else's. And you just focus on something that is already working, and progressively you can rebrand it if you desire to do that. But the key point there is you don't have to face the startup challenges. You don't need to wait a long time to get your money back. And from an operational standpoint, it might also be easier for you to do. I think a lot of people underestimate the opportunity that acquisitions are in the UAE simply because they think they're going to be more expensive than starting a business from scratch. And that's another interesting thing, because again, I've found after looking at more than 3,000 businesses in the UAE that that's not the case. It's very expensive to start a business here, or even start a branch of your existing business here. And in some cases, it's even cheaper to buy an existing one that already has cash flow. And so it's a nice way for me to say that my model is the best one, and that if you're thinking about UAE, you should really consider acquisitions. But that's just the reality. I mean, I can give you countless examples of healthcare businesses, beauty businesses, online businesses for that matter. Acquiring one instead of starting something from scratch has been very, very beneficial. Of course, a lot of different challenges that happen once you dive deeper into this, because you need to be aware of the things, again, hiding below the surface. But the point is, if UAE are a target, probably acquisitions are a very good pick. If then you want to branch out in Oman and Saudi or other places of the Middle East, maybe starting a new location might make a lot of sense, because there's a lot of untapped potential and a lot of market share that you can conquer, and it might make more sense in those types of geographies. But for UAE, my personal experience has been that acquisitions are a very good way to start, and to some respect, they're a way to turn your competition into cash, right? Because you find somebody who has already done the effort, invested the money, generated the results in a competitive landscape like this, and then you just buy them out. And that's very, very good. I've seen many businesses being successful with this, either acquiring turnaround opportunities or acquiring profitable ones. If that is of interest to you, check the links below, because it will be important for us to see how we can support you with this. Most people don't get that you need to get on the ground support for these types of things, because international knowledge won't really cut it. There are nuances in this region that you need to be able to navigate. And this is another important point, which applies not only to acquisitions, which is what we do, but also to setting up a business, building up a branch, building up partnership, not only UAE, but Saudi, Oman, all the Middle East. There are nuances and ways of conducting business that people coming from outside simply don't get. And that kind of ties back to my first point about setting up an office and sending directors there without you being the key person having the meetings and doing the business here. There's another level to it, and that is the problem of sending people who are not experienced about the region into this place and have them build your own presence in the country. it makes a lot of sense for a lot of companies because, again, they have their trained staff, they already have them under their umbrella, and they want them to be the guys who deliver, right? The problem is these guys are going to have no clue about how the region works, and they're going to get smashed. I mean, I'll be totally frank with you. I mean, one of the things that I need to change in my approach when I first came here was my core belief that a big name when it comes to accounting or legal representation was all that mattered when selecting, my partners. We had to do a lot with accountants and lawyers when we do acquisitions. And back in the day, I used to believe that, big fours or big names were the place for me to go, right? The problem was that big firms didn't operate the way they operate in other parts of the world. And in some respect, their name wasn't a guarantee of good work and success. And I'm going to explain the reasons in a second. In most cases, what you were finding when building partnerships with these big firms was that they were sending out their partners from London, UK, or New York, or whatever, to be there and represent their firm in the region. So they were partners at, a firm in Abu Dhabi or Dubai or Riyadh, whatever. But they were coming with a European or American background, and they had, a few weeks of experience dealing in the Middle East. That was a huge challenge because despite their wealth of knowledge in the specific vertical that we're covering, they didn't have the, street experience, so to speak. And so that knowledge was just kind of like book knowledge to some respect. They didn't have that scar tissue that you build once you're in the Middle East for some time. And so despite them being excellent people, excellent professionals, they couldn't really support us so well in the region. And another problem that happened with these big firms was that they were having these guys represent you, but of course the work was not done entirely by them, right? They had associates and other people working on their behalf. And these people sometimes were not as quality as the top guy, or not as quality as the same person might be in another part of the world. And that created a lot of challenges. You can go ahead and check one of the most recent cases happening to KPMG. It's an interesting read, what happened to them here in the UAE. I'm not going to talk I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but you can go ahead and find out more. The point is, I realized that local experience was all that mattered here, even if it was coming from a small firm. And I started to work with the people who spend the 10, the 20, the 30 years here, who might not be working for a big firm, but they might have a mid or small firm, but they actually know everything there is to know about UAE, Saudi, Oman, whatever. They know how to solve problems when they happen. They know how to navigate situations that don't happen in other parts of the world. And they know how to get the job done, which is ultimately what matters to you as well. I'm quite sure about it. So my point is, I had to realize that local expertise was all that mattered, which is why I'm stressing the concept of working with professionals that have experience on the ground, and why we are so good at doing, deal flow sourcing, relationship building, and acquisitions on behalf of other companies, because we have this network of experiences. We know how the market operates. We know how everything works here. And we know where the skeletons are, which is the most important thing. Because again, and that leads me back to my first point about data not being clear in the region. A lot of people make decisions on paper, right? The bigger the company, the more common that is. That is the worst thing you can do in the Middle East, based on my experience, because you won't even imagine what some people will put on paper here. And in order for you to really understand what's happening, you need to be there and understand and see with your own eyes. Or if you're not there personally, have somebody trusted who has been in the region for a long time and can tell you clearly, what's happening, what's real, what's not real, and how you should operate, how you should deal with these situations. Otherwise, you're just gonna be spinning around in circles. And I've been spinning around in circles myself. I mean, I wasted almost a year doing things the conventional ways, so to speak, just to realize that I wasn't gonna get anywhere, because people were playing games on me and they were taking me for rides. And again, I've been a bit naive for sure, but I've been surprised in seeing how many big companies are naive about this aspect too. Now, of course, if you are a business owner, entrepreneur, or executive of a 7, 8, 9-figure company, you might be thinking that you have a fair understanding about how business works, right? You certainly have your scar tissue, but I'm just telling you in total transparency, nothing can compare to the Middle East. You got to be very aware of what the challenges are, and most of the challenges are not going to come from what you see on paper. They're going to come from real life situations that you need to be able to navigate, and you need to navigate those in a very unique way that is unique to the region. Now, depending on what your goals are, you're going to face different challenges. What I talk a lot about is acquisition, because that's what we do. But I think it is important for people to totally grasp that Middle East are a complex place to do business in. And I don't want to scare you away, because the opportunity is there. I just want you to be fully aware of pros and cons. The pro is definitely the opportunity, what everybody's selling you. The cons are that there are a lot of gray areas, just to put it simply. And you got to accept that, because I don't want to patronize you here, but those things are going to be very difficult to change. And as a stubborn young guy, I tried to change it myself and got a lot of beatings for it, and ultimately realized that it was much better to just accept certain things and learn how to deal with them, so that we can accomplish the desired outcome. Because the outcome can still be achieved, don't get me wrong, but there are different ways to get there, and sometimes people just want to go straight. It might not necessarily be the best thing for you to do here. Might take you a bit longer, but it is the only way that is going to really work. So there are a lot of things that I really could share about my personal experience here. A lot of things that got messed up because of my perception of things that wasn't really accurate. I think it all boils down to the fact that on the ground experience, people who are trusted here are going to be key for you. And approaching the region in a very open-minded way is key. Not wanting to go straight to the point, and approaching it as a relationship exercise, and really understanding that there's a lot more than business that you will have to do if you really want to succeed here. Of course, if you're considering acquisitions, we are the best place to start. I mean, nobody's actually doing acquisitions here in the region. I mean, you can go to the big advisory firms, but they're just going to stick to the billion-dollar deals, because that's the way people deal with, in the region. If you're interested in acquiring maybe smaller businesses, let's say between 5 to 100 million, then we are the best place to start, because nobody's actually touching these types of businesses. Nobody knows what's happening there better than we do. And for all other inquiries like starting a business, setting up a branch of your existing one, we also know good people who can help you with that. It's not going to be us directly, because that's not our specialty. We are more into the acquisition space, but there's still a lot of things that we can collaborate on, and some things we can do together. So hopefully this kind of like brain dump was of some help. At least to crystallize the fact that the Middle East is not a straightforward place.